When World War II ended, the working relationship between the USA, Britain, and Russia began to come to an end. When there was no need to unite to defeat Germany and Japan, the differences between the capitalist West and communist East came forth once more.
The Cold War began as tensions began to grow between the capitalist West and the communist East. The Cold War was called the Cold War because no actual fighting actually took place. A hot war would be one that involved military conflict.
Australians were convinced of the dangers of communism and believed communists who had infiltrated our trade unions and political parties threatened our economic prosperity. They watched newsreels and anti-communist films of the 1950s that explained how communism had subjugated over 800 million people. Communists and their sympathisers were now regarded as un-Australian and potential subversives.
A foreign policy is a strategy implemented by politicians in relation to dealing with other nations. The beliefs of the foreign policy was that communism, particularly in Asia, was a threat to Australia.
After World War II, Australia realised it could never adequately defend itself. Menzies called powerful countries our great and powerful friends. Australia sought to strengthen their relationship with Britain and the US.
Australia had to prove his loyalty as an ally. In 1950, Australia became the first nation to support the USA in the war against communism in Korea. In the 50s, Australia supported the British in Malaya, and in the 60s, Australia supported the USA in Vietnam.
The forward defence policy said it was in Australia's best interest to meet any threats as far away from Australian land as possible. The forward defence policy saw Australia set up military bases outside Australia and send troops to Korea, Malaya, and Vietnam to fight the menace of Asian communism.
The Communist Party of Australia, or CPA, was founded in 1920, but soon split into two fractions. One of these gained financial support from Communist International in Russia and set about influencing trade unions and the ALP.
The CPA had little effect until the Great Depression, when it began organising groups of unemployed and gaining leadership positions in mining, metal and transport unions. Membership was around 4,000 in the 1930s. However, when the USSR entered World War II on the side of England, the CPA gave strong support to the war effort and membership grew to 20,000.
The Communist Party of Australia changed its name to the Australian Communist Party in 1944. In 1949, Menzies made communism an election issue and promised to ban the CPA if he was elected. Most of Labor opposed this bill, saying it challenged basic human rights. Although the bill was passed, 6 Australian judges declared it unconstitutional the year after. A referendum was unsuccessful, but only by a margin. Cold War propaganda and rise of communism heightened fears of the Red Menace in China.
Having failed to win referendum on constitutional change, Menzies stepped up in the hunt for Reds under the beds. Petrov had been a cipher clerk with the Soviet spy organisation since 1933. In 1951, as a full agent, he had been sent to Australia under diplomatic cover to make sure other Soviet citizens in Australia did not defect. When he defected, Petrov brought with him allegations of spying by Soviet agents in Australia and alleged documented evidence for this.
2 days before the Parliament broke up, Menzies made the announcement that a Soviet spy had defected to Australia. The country went into uproar, but the story made even bigger headlines. When Petrov was allowed to stay, but Soviet officials tried to take his wife back to the USSR. They forced her on board a plane, but when it made a fuel stop in Darwin, Australian officials offered her asylum and she accepted. It was huge news at the time. The newspapers were full of pictures of a frightened, crying Mrs. Petrov being led onto the plane in Sydney.
Some historians believe that the Petrov defection was a set-up by the ASIO to prove it's worthy as a security agency. Whether or not the defection and the evidence of the spying were real, it had a huge impact on Australian society. It is also not possible to determine if Petrov ever did produce concrete evidence of the espionage taking place. However, not one criminal charge resulted from the Petrov Commission.
Meanwhile, the already declining Communist Party of Australia lost even more support after the Petrov affair. Apart from the fact that many people's worst fears about communist spying seemed to be true, if communism was so great, why would someone want to defect?
The Great momentous domestic outcome of the Petrov affair was the Labour Party split, which had immediate and long-lasting consequences for the Labour Party and the Australian political landscape. During the 1950s, the issue of communism and support for communist causes or governments caused great internal conflict in the Labour Party and the trade union movement in general.
Catholics were an important traditional support base from 1945. Staunchly anti-communist Roman Catholic member formed industrial groups to gain control of unions. After bitter public disputes, many groupers were expelled from the ALP and formed the Democratic Labour Party, or the DLP, whose leader was B.A. Santa Maria. The DLP was heavily influenced by Catholic social teaching and had the support of the Catholic Archbishop of Melbourne, Daniel Mannix. The DLP's preferences helped the Liberal Party of Australia remain in power for over 2 decades, but the Whitlam Labor government successfully undermined it during the 1970s.